Well, my editing skills are crap, but can the same thing be said about Tenet? Stick around and find out. Hey, I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. This is my uncut review of Tenet. The synopsis on IMDb reads, armed with only one word, Tenet, and fighting for the survival of the entire world, a protagonist, that's really his name, protagonist, well, kind of, journeys through a twilight world of international espionage on a mission that will unfold in something beyond real time. I would just add by way of description so you kind of get an idea of what this movie is. The future is out to destroy the present. There's some group or people or something in the future that are out to destroy the present. And they use time inversion to send objects and people back to achieve their goal, which is kind of like time travel, except instead of instantly going back to the point in time that you're traveling to, you are enabled to start moving backward in time. So time is still passing for you at the same pace, but you are moving backward in time, or the object or whatever it is moving backward in time at the same speed that time is moving forward. So it's a really cool concept. It has results in some really strong visual gags. Anyway, so there's this. The bad guys from the future, whoever they are sending objects and people back to achieve their goal. This shadow organization is aware of and able to use time inversion, and they're fighting back to save the world from the evil plans of the future, whoever they are. I would describe what this kind of movie feels like, apart from the obvious pseudo-time travel elements. It's a time heist, as made famous by Ant-Man. It's, here's a problem. Now here's a plan. Let's hatch a plan that we have to carefully execute on in order to deal with this problem. And now watch us execute on that carefully crafted plan and overcome some unexpected problems along the way. That's what kind of movie this is. When the time concepts are introduced, time inversion is introduced early on in the movie to the protagonist, who is supposed to be kind of the fish out of water, although he doesn't feel like it. He seems to adapt pretty readily to everything that's going on, which, it is not my preference, but it doesn't need to be that kind of movie, Anyway, when he's having this stuff explained to him for the first time, they go a little ways to explain it, but very quickly, basically, they say, a character says, don't try to think about it. Just feel. She's trying to get him to see how this bullet, which is time inverted and moving backward through time, could actually fly up into his hand. I think this is even in the trailers. And because from its perspective, he would have dropped it, And so the logic of figuring out, okay, well then, how are you supposed to know what you are doing with this object, that what you are destined to do with this object that is moving backward in time? Well, there's no way that you can know that. So that's why they introduce this idea of don't try to think about it, just feel. And so, of course, he does that, he feels or whatever, and then it flies up into his hand, and he just kind of comments instinct. Like, okay, just got to operate on instinct. And so it creates these neat visual gags, but there is no logic to how the nuts and bolts of it actually work. They do set up some rules, some physics that are going to be true of objects and people that are time inverted and as they interact with the normal world. But apart from those that are stated, there doesn't seem to be particular logic that applies to other things that you might expect it to if you think about this very much. And I suspect that's why they just put in the script while they're explaining the concept, listen, don't try to think about it, just feel like, okay. But then that sets me up for to miss out on what I think the script does want me to think about. I'm baffled by this script, and more so than any Christopher Nolan script and movie that I've seen so far. He does have some very high cerebral concepts going on in many of his movies. And so to have part of that central concept be presented in a way that says, listen, don't try to think about this too deeply, kind of made me go, Okay, all right, well, then I'll just kind of sit back and go along for the ride. But the problem is this plot and some of the concepts that the plot hangs on, I think, are meant to be mentally wrestled with and understood in order to appreciate what this movie is. So it's weird. Like, I want to ask Nolan, I mean, what is your intention here? Do you want me to try and not think about anything, or do you want me to pay attention to character motivations and think about that sort of thing? Do you want me to pay attention to the plot and kind of try to track and follow along with that and kind of figure out what's going on? I think that he does regarding the plot. And Christopher Nolan, although he doesn't do this with all of his movies, he definitely did write this one. And he's the only credited writer. I wonder if it could have really benefited from having another writer involved, even just to work the logic of the concept, so that it could be presented in a way that has consistent rules and without this appeal to just not think about it and feel instead, because I really think that putting that in there so early in the movie set me up in a way to not really track and pay attention like I should have to other elements in the movie. It felt like, in some ways, the movie, if it were a living entity, would be saying to me, "Yes, care about my plot. It's very meticulously thought out. Care about characters and their motivations if you want, but good luck with keeping track of anything, because we're going to muffle all the voices." Now, this is something that seems to be a thing. It can't be an accident. It's got to be an intentional choice being made in post-production, maybe even while filming as well, by Nolan. I might have heard at one point someone that was a film buff told me that he makes his films, and I don't know if this is true at all, he makes his films in such a way that you should be able to follow them without the dialogue. And they're meant to be appreciated on that level, just on a visual level. And he is a very visual director. He creates very striking visuals. He obviously cares about them. A number of shots change the aspect ratio to accommodate IMAX screenings. And so he definitely cares about visuals and creating something interesting visually. But I think he also cares about these really high concepts, but it's so weird that he muffles dialogue. I mean, Bane is a notorious example of that, but other movies as well, this happens when characters aren't wearing masks, but the mix of the dialogue in the audio is low compared to music and other background elements and stuff, so that you're, maybe he wants me to lean forward. I don't know. I watched this at home. I can't imagine trying to follow this in a theater. It wasn't that I didn't have it loud enough. We've got a really nice sound system, I think, relatively speaking, and I cranked it up as loud as I could. I didn't have any complaints from family. I just cranked it up. I was like, I want to hear what's going on. But it's not about the volume itself. It's the volume relative to the other elements going on. And then also, in the back half of the movie especially, you have a ton of people wearing breathing apparatuses, which is muffling their voices. And so you add that to the low level of the volume in the dialogue in the mix, and I'm just like, what in the world? It feels like a movie that wants to be appreciated for its deeply thought out plot complexity, but wants me to selectively turn my brain off about the rules and logic of the core concept, and then also make story details and even core concept details hard or impossible to follow and understand without subtitles and a rewind button. By the time I realized that they wanted me to appreciate the plot structure, I was too far lost, because they told me not to think, seemingly, and then they just I feel like they dunked all the microphones in water before calling action in many of the shots. So, I mean, there was one point where, like, these guys were talking exposition. They both had masks on, and it got so muffled at one point. I was reading with subtitles. I mean, like, probably about like halfway through the movie, maybe a little before the halfway point or after, I turned on subtitles, just kept them on the rest of the movie. And I just laughed out loud. At first, I was straining to listen, and then he said, and I'm like, I just laughed out loud because I couldn't believe that they expected anyone to understand what he was saying apart from subtitles. A lot of the time, it would just be like a word here or there that I would miss, and it got to be enough that I was like, I'm just going to turn subtitles on. I don't want to end up having to rewind too much, And by the way, I just had my hearing tested. I have very good hearing, so this was not some weird phenomenon that I was experiencing because of deficiency in my hearing. This is something really going on in these movies, and I'm baffled by this choice. The gags were all cool to look at, but I was almost completely disengaged from the plot because of how lost I felt. And yet I also found several plot elements at the end of the movie to be very predictable, which is such a weird combo. I'm like, okay, yeah, that's what's going on here, and this is going to happen, da 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 da. But there was still a lot of stuff that I was like, I'm not sure, like for about 10 minutes, what was going on there in this movie, you know. So what I would really love to see is this specific time travel concept, because it is very novel. It's very specific and very novel. The only other time I think I've seen this before in any fiction was in a Piers Anthony book about a character who basically was the incarnation of time itself, and he lived his life backwards relative to everyone else. He experienced the flow of time moving backward through time at the normal speed that people do moving forward. So it was this same concept, except he didn't, stop and start and have ways of kind of going in and out of time inversion. He was constantly, once he assumed the role of time, he was in a time inverted state, always moving backward, I think, or at least that was his default. Anyway, so this is a very novel concept. It's very rare to see it used. I would like to see someone else pick up this concept and flesh out the logic and rules of it so that we don't have to have an appeal to feeling and instinct, and can actually have, especially if it's going to be a story like this one. I guess the alternative would be to take this idea, run with it, but then not have a story that you're asked to really lean forward and think very logically about, and keep track of all kinds of different things, and really be able to put together this logic puzzle in order to appreciate the plot. If you want me to do a logic puzzle to appreciate the plot, then don't tell me to feel and not think, and have a concept, a core concept that's not really logically fleshed out. So anyway, so that's what I feel about that. As far as like the cast and performances go, I mean, I thought the performances were all fine. Elizabeth Debicki, I'm not familiar with her. I just looked up her name. She stands out a little to me as a mother trapped in an abusive relationship, but Kenneth Branagh probably is the big standout to me. He makes a very disturbing sociopathic villain in this movie. The two male leads are not given many character traits to work with. They strike me as just agents in an organization trying to solve problems. Every once in a while you get an offhanded, humorous remark or whatever, but that's not a personality necessarily. That's just like little bits of witty banter here and there on the side, So, and as I said, I really felt a lack of fish out of water from the main character, from the protagonist, that I think could have been brought in with the performance as well, but maybe since it wasn't on the written page, he didn't feel inspired to bring any subtext that would bring more fish out of water flavor to it. But I just didn't feel like these characters were fleshed out. I didn't know who they were really. As far as like the stunts and visuals, I mean, this movie is a movie that's made for its visual gags. It strikes me, and I don't know because I'm not a mind reader, but it strikes me that, it seems to me, let's abort that sentence, that wasn't working out. I would speculate that Christopher Nolan had this cool idea for this visual gag that he wanted to keep using in different ways throughout the movie, and then he was like, how can I make a plot that's going to fit that? And so he got the plot figured out to make the visual gags work, and then the last thing to be worked on was the logic of the time, inversion itself. And so it seems like it was probably constructed in that order. It's very cool to look at, especially near the climax when the forward and reverse time elements are constantly in play all over the screen. I really want to watch a documentary on how the visual effects and the shots were made, because it was probably employing multiple techniques. But that was my deepest level of interest, was from a technical filmmaking point of view. I wasn't engaged in the story, unfortunately. I don't comment on the sound and music on every review that I do, but I'll just say again, the music and effects given priority over even non-muffled dialogue in this thing. I'm so puzzled by what seems to be Nolan's conflicting desire to present complex stories, but then hinder you from appreciating them by obscuring dialogue. I just don't get it. Anyway, as far as, are there any themes of moral, philosophical, spiritual significance that might trigger some worthwhile thought or conversation. I mean, they're maybe there just by nature of dealing with time travel. You're going to potentially run into some themes. There's the think or feel moment at the beginning, but I think that was less of a theme in the movie and more just kind of like trying to tell the audience, listen, don't waste time trying to figure this out. Just go on this ride with us. So I don't think that's really a theme. There is definitely the concept of A theory versus B theory. I mean, they don't present both A theory and B theory of time, but it, like all time travel movies, depends on the B theory concept. And what that means is the B theory says that time in the present and the past exists, and it's basically like a flat plane that all exists, but we, from our limited perspective, are only capable of experiencing what we call the now. Whereas A theory of time says that temporal becoming, one moment becoming the next, and atoms and things all changing and moving, that is real. That's not just an illusion created by our limited perspective, but temporal becoming is actually real, and the past and the future do not actually exist, so that even if time travel were invented, there would not be a past to go to. You couldn't create time travel because there's nowhere to go to. All there is the now. And so I have been increasingly persuaded over the recent years to subscribe to the A theory of time, even though time travel stories all depend on B theory. And scientists may talk about time as in terms of B theory, but as like, think of it like a straight line, But really, scientists who study time and philosophers who study time are very much in disagreement about the nature of time itself. It's not conclusive at all that the B theory is true. That's a device that is used because mathematically it allows them to explore different possibilities of time. But it's not that literally scientists are saying that time actually is a line, So that's something that I think a lot of us have just kind of accepted as default because of all these time travel movies that we've seen. But actually our instinctual experience of time is much more, I think, likely to be true, and that is that temporal becoming is real. It is not merely an illusion of our limited perception. So there's that. And believe it or not, even though that sounds like just a weird cerebral kind of thing, that actually has a lot of ramifications related to the nature of God, the nature of free will, the nature of who humans are. So it's worth exploring if you want to. Free will also comes into play just a little bit here and there, what is the nature of causality, and then briefly parallel realities and the multiverse are touched on, but that's more of like just a possibility that's presented in the story. The way that the actual story is constructed does not assume parallel realities in the multiverse, which I really appreciate. That's why I think it has to be constructed so carefully. When you only have one timeline to work with and you're telling a time travel story, you have to be so much more thought out and meticulous in your scripting, in your construction of that plot, because you can't just say, oh yeah, well, we've changed time or we've jumped to another timeline. It's just this one unchanging timeline that we are dealing with here. And so I really do appreciate this movie on that level. I wish that many more time travel movies would remove the easy outs of parallel realities and the ability to change time, and would instead deal with this kind of concept of just one single timeline. So, but anyway, multiverse hypothesis is something that's brought up by some non-theists to explain different elements of how the universe is the way it is, instead of admitting that actually design and a designer, it makes a lot of sense here. So I think those are relevant also to matters of faith and philosophy and the different things that we might think about God and ourselves. So I think that there are some things here, but again, as I've said in past reviews, the nature of the movie, for me, disconnects me from the experience so much that I'm highly unlikely to engage in thinking about some of the potential themes that the content of the movie might trigger in my mind. All right, so I have no idea what your tastes are in movies, but if I were a time traveler, I'd go back in time and say, oh, skip this one, Pater. The visual gags are the only thing that it has for you. The rest while much of it intelligently crafted in some respects, is not worth the struggle past the barriers that it creates for you to appreciate it. It's rated PG-13 for intense sequences of violence and action, some suggestive references, and brief, strong language. All right, those are my thoughts. I'd love to get yours in the comments below. Please like, share, subscribe, click that bell to stay connected. Anything you want to do to share this content with others, I would really, really appreciate it. And I want to thank the Spirit Blade Insiders for making this review possible. For more information about the benefits about becoming a Spirit Blade Insider, go check out patreon.com/SpiritBlade Productions. And then, as always, I hope you'll join us soon over at christiangeekcentral.com as we continue to geek out and seek the